Shaul takes this illustration from the classical Greek-Roman culture to help emphasize his most crucial point. The job of this servant was to help in every way conduct the daily life of the child. Walking closely to and from school, he was responsible for the health, welfare, and safety of the child. Never to let the child out of his sight. What was his job? His job was to bring him to his teacher. He was not the teacher. He was to bring him to his teacher. Okay? And he would never let the child out of his sight. He was in every way responsible for the safety of the child, and in that way he was seen as the bodyguard. Here is one example of the influence of the pedagogos in classical Greek thought, and this will help kind of... This is an illustration here of... I don't know how many of you have read Plato's The Republic. I had the chance back in school years ago, and it's a little boring, but nonetheless, it's pretty insightful in certain areas. Socrates says, do your parents let you control yourself, or will they not trust you in that either? And the boy says, of course they do not trust me. Socrates says, but someone is in control of you. Yes, my pedagogos here. Is he a slave? Why, certainly, he belongs to us. What a strange thing, a free man controlled by a slave. How does this pedagogos exert his control over you? By taking me to my teacher. Now keep that in mind. So we see that the pedagogos was not the child's jailer, as some translations would hint at. But rather the child's guardian. Rabbi Paul tells the Gentile audience in Galatia that the Torah kept the Jewish people safe, and if it was doing its job properly, it was to take them to Yeshua, their teacher. That was the job, to protect them and to guard them until that moment. The Torah kept the people safe and inside for their school lessons. Now when he talks about being enclosed, he's talking about schoolroom. Okay? Because the job was to take him to his teacher in the schoolroom. What would the pedagogos do? Remember, he wasn't ever to leave the child, to leave the sight. He would stay there, in the presence of the child, in the presence of the teacher, while the child learned from the teacher. But the servant never left, because where did the child have to go to after school? He had to walk back home. Okay? And the responsibility lay upon this tutor to walk to and from to the teacher every single day. And he would not, the safety was upon him. Okay? He had to stand in the back of the class, lest the child was one of the unruly children, and they decide to skip out of the class if it was too warm. Okay? What would happen to a child, possibly, going into the woods, being lost? They could be killed, kidnapped, anything could happen, injured. The responsibility of Torah was to keep the child from being injured until it brought the child to its goal. But to and fro every day, he would go to learn from the teacher. But that was the goal that was the purpose of Torah. It never left. Safe and inside, relinquishing them to the Messiah, but only when they were in his presence. They had to go back home too. The teacher wouldn't go necessarily with the child back home. The tutor was responsible for that. Now we are talking about the concept of salvation. So what does he mean when he says we are no longer under a tutor? We don't need a tutor anymore. We know that the very premise that Shaul is using here, this very picture, completely contradicts that he's saying. It doesn't make any sense. Well, he's talking about salvation. That was never the goal of the tutor or the pedagogos, to provide salvation for the child. He was waiting until the teacher arrived so that he could take him there so that he could learn from the teacher. Now, when he's saying we're no longer under a tutor, he's talking about salvation. Okay? Messiah has come. We aren't necessarily... He wasn't saying that we were saved by the Torah, but there was in essence a life and a type of salvation that came through the observance of Torah to a certain extent before the Master came. Okay? So we're not talking he's trying to distinguish here between the men who have infiltrated the Galatian community and the role of the Torah, the real role of Torah, to justify us. These individuals were coming into the community saying, you as non-Jews have to be circumcised. Okay? You have to observe all of the Torah before you can be considered saved. But that's not the purpose. The purpose has been flipped upside down on its head. And Shaul is coming here to clarify the very purpose of the tutor and what his job was. It wasn't necessarily to provide salvation, it was to usher you to salvation. But it never left the side of the child. So when you talk about not being under a tutor, we're talking about being saved. The tutor doesn't leave, and he's not nullified. He still has to protect the child. The major issues were physical circumcision and the conversion of non-Jews to Judaism for the means of salvation. Prior to the revelation of Messiah, it made perfect sense for one who was not, quote-unquote, under the law. Remember, I'm using this in a halakhic sense now, because it was kind of a rabbinic term. Because Jews were under the law, they were under its rule, its sovereignty, its subjection to a certain extent, as were proselytes. God-fearers were not, because they didn't undergo circumcision. Non-Jews were not under the law. Okay? Prior to that revelation, it made perfect sense for one to go under the law, place himself or herself under it, as it served to protect them. Okay? It made perfect sense. The way in which you related to the God of Israel and to his covenants was how, back then, before Messiah came. You could only do it through the covenantal system that had been set up through the nation of Israel. That was the only way. And the next logical step was conversion, to fully immerse yourself into that community. That was acceptable, and it made perfect sense. But now that Messiah has come, we're building upon these covenants. Okay? We're not abrogating the previous covenant that this is being built upon. We are adding to it. We're starting to relate and to see things a little bit differently. This is essentially a replay of Acts chapter 15, but in a more detailed form. What do Gentiles have to do to be saved? Well, they don't any longer need to become circumcised and to observe all of the Torah in a fully conversionary process. Okay? Many times in the Torah, we see justification, which leads up to sanctification. Okay? The redemption of the nation of Israel in Egypt, the blood of the lambs. Okay? Then they were sanctified at Sinai with the covenant. Okay? They weren't redeemed by the Torah, they were redeemed in Egypt. Abraham, he was given the gift of righteousness because he believed. Then he was circumcised. Now, these tenets that are completely Torah-based are being flipped upside down by these people who are infiltrating the community, and they're being told that it's now the opposite. That in order to be saved, it has to be based on something that you are doing physically. Well, Shaul says, no, 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 no. Look at it in the scriptures. It has nothing to do with that at all. This is the step-by-step process. All Shaul is doing is showing us the way in which the Torah is to operate in our lives. It's not contradicting anything. Context. Context. Galatians 5, 1 through 6. It was for freedom the Messiah set us free, therefore keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, Messiah will be of no benefit to you. And I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. You have been severed from Messiah, you who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit, by faith, are awaiting for the hope of righteousness. For in Messiah Yeshua, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith working through love. Now, if one keeps in mind the theme of this text, again, that Shaul is a devout Jew, and the threat he sees to the non-Jewish readers of this letter, clear distinctions can begin to be drawn. Our tendency has been to see such letters as blanket statements for everyone. Jew, non-Jew, Messianic Jew, Christian, Jew, Gentile. Okay, it doesn't matter who you are. Paul's talking about everybody here. Okay? Now, when it came to salvation, yes. But look at what he says here. Here he continues to speak directly to the God-fearers, and you have to keep this in mind. He's talking about a God-fearing community. There may have been some converts, some proselytes there, but overall, he's talking about God-fearers. They have not necessarily converted to formally to Judaism. He's speaking to them in very stern terms regarding their need to be justified through a conversionary process. By doing so, the power of Messiah is diminished because Messiah is the ultimate goal. And he says that in Romans 10:4. That Messiah is the goal that the tutor aimed for. Come along, child, let's go to school. I'm leading you to your teacher. The goal of our walking process is the teacher. It's not the end of the law, okay? The pedagogos didn't leave the child in the presence of the teacher and just, hey, I'm a free man now. No, he was hired and oftentimes a slave of the family. What would happen in Grecian or Roman times if a slave just deserted his master? He'd be put to death. It didn't happen. It wasn't a reality. His life depended on it. Outside of the Messiah, the only way this could be achieved to become sons and daughters of Abraham was to go under the law, halakhically speaking. But these are not converts, and Paul reminds us here that they are not under the law. He's saying you're God-fearers, you're not proselytes, and you're not Jews. Undergoing a conversionary circumcision with the hopes of being found acceptable before God as a result of that conversion and circumcision is what he's addressing here. He says if that's what you do to find yourself justified, Messiah died for nothing. Because the very purpose of Messiah's death was so that we could be found acceptable before God. Now you are trying to find yourself acceptable through your actions. And it's Torah upside down. It's first sanctification, which leads up to justification. It doesn't make any sense. It's not how God's word works. Our own righteousness is as filthy rags, the scriptures say. But his graciousness is everything. And only through him could we be considered righteous and holy. These are not converts. Shaul further warns them that if they choose to become Gerim Tzadikim, and we learned about that 2 classes ago, proselytes of righteousness, which are all the way converted, male or female, that they would become obligated to observe all of Torah. They would now be literally under the law. Okay? Because there were precepts, there were portions of the Torah which were for Jews only. And he says, now, mind you, if you do this, not only are we going to have issues with Messiah and what he came to do, but you are now willingly obligating yourself for all Torah observance, just like Jews and just like proselytes. Okay? You would become obligated to its entirety. Your days as God-fearers would be over, and the yoke that neither we nor our fathers could bear, as Shimon described it, be placed upon your shoulders. Okay? That's not to say that Shaul and Shimon and all these individuals saw the truth of Torah like King David did. Okay? But the reality of the day was that if you were considered under the law, you took upon the yoke of the commandments upon yourself. Okay? The yoke of the mitzvot, and we talked about that. They were inseparable. You took upon all of the traditions, all of the customs, and you lived your life. You were obligated to that. Shaul says, be careful what you wish for. Okay? Because it changes your life completely. Now, don't forget that God-fearers were no slouches when it came to observance. It wasn't a free-for-all party. It wasn't a lawlessness. You remember the God-fearers a couple of classes ago. They too had requirements. There were no slouches when it came to observance. Noahide commands, Shabbat, dietary laws. They were required to maintain synagogue discipleship. You know, when Yaakov said in Acts 15:21, you know, let's relinquish them to the synagogue. Let them do these 4 things. But you know, on Shabbat, Moses is taught. Those things will take care of themselves. They were required to maintain a synagogue discipleship. This wasn't lawlessness here. So they were observing, and observing many things. Yet there were those, just as in Acts 15, who saw this as inadequate for the non-Jewish community.